All right, friends, it's time to give you loyal listeners a discount on protein powder. You may or may not know, but I launched my very first protein powder 2 years ago. It's a grass-fed beef isolate with only 3 ingredients: grass-fed beef, either organic cacao or organic vanilla, and organic monk fruit. Now, if you don't want any of the added flavor and sweeteners, you can also just get unflavored. And no matter what flavor you choose, you're getting over 23 grams of protein per scoop, which is going to keep you full and satisfied between meals. I love starting my day with a Fab4 smoothie and breaking my fast with that much protein. It makes a serious difference in my cravings and blood sugar balance the rest of the day, and I've seen it with my clients as well. Now, I never thought I'd own a product company, but when I got pregnant with Sebastian, I realized the majority of protein powders were chemically extracted or enzymatically extracted, and I wanted to use heat and water only. I wanted minimal ingredients because we don't need those emulsifiers, fillers, or added vitamins, minerals, and probiotics. All of those additions increase the chances that it's not going to work for your body, whether it be bloating, digestion issues. I just wanted pure, clean protein to keep you full and satisfied so you could build the most delicious Fab4 smoothie. And I have to say, I'm pretty proud of the flavor. If you take a look at our reviews on Amazon, you'll see 5-star reviews for flavor. And that is key, because if you don't love your Fab4 smoothie and you don't love drinking your protein powder, you're not going to do it. It won't become a habit, and it's consistency that outpaces everything. So if you're here and you're listening and you want to give our protein powder a try, use the code podcast5 for $5 off your order. And let me know if you love it. My favorite ways to apply this protein powder is in my Fab4 smoothie, making freezer fudge, making chocolate milk, making hot chocolate, and throwing the unflavored into all my kids' baked goods. So let me know how you use it. Let me know if you love it, and share this podcast deal with your friends. Today's guests are Tina Anderson and Kiran Krishnan. Tina Anderson is a former attorney turned healthcare CEO. She and her husband, Billy, followed their passion for health and wellness and partnered together to launch Just Thrive, a probiotic and supplement brand. Just Thrive probiotics are spore-based and some of the most effective on the market. If you listen to our previous episode, you know that spore-based probiotics really helped Sebastian heal through the first few months of his life and clear up his eczema. Tina is passionate about promoting gut health and spreading her knowledge far and wide about the benefits of probiotics. Kiran Krishnan is a research microbiologist and has been involved in the dietary supplements and nutrition market for the past 20 years. He comes from a strict research background and having several years with hands-on R&D experience in the field of molecular medicine and microbiology at the University of Iowa, and human clinical research, conducted over 50 human trials and published a dozen himself. Tina and her husband worked with Kiran to develop the Just Thrive spore-based probiotics and the brand new supplement, Just Calm. I'm so excited for Kiran to jump on here and give us all the education around our immune system and how Just Calm and the BL1714 in Just Calm can support us through Psychobiotics. So you're going to learn a lot in this episode. It was so fun. I could have gone for hours, but it's a good one. So tune in. Tina, Kiran, welcome back to the show. I'm so excited. We had our previous episode talking all about spore-based probiotics and gut health and all the research coming out there. I loved how jam-packed that was, full of just things like understanding how polyphenols are taken up into our bloodstream and what's producing those in our gut, and really cool stuff. So if you haven't listened to our first episode, please go back. I'll link it in the show notes and listen to part 1. And today we'll go through part 2 because there's some new and exciting information about psychobiotics. And I would love to give everyone the 101 on what psychobiotics are. You just released your new Just Calm, which is a proprietary blend of psychobiotics. And I think we just need to start from the beginning, because I love all these episodes to be educational, almost the 101 of what is it? When did we learn about it? What does it do? And how does this proprietary blend from Just Thrive, how does it differ and how is it beneficial?
Great. So our psychobiotic is basically the friendly bacteria that is controlling the gut-brain axis. So we know that there is this gut-brain axis. I think we talked about it, in fact, on our last episode. We call it the communication superhighway. The vagus nerve the gut is constantly sending signals from the gut, from the gut to the brain, and then from the brain to the gut. And that is a very important relationship. And we already knew that. And we've been, a lot of research has been researching about this. And, what we always say is that people talk about the gut being the second brain, but in our opinion, it's kind of the first brain. It is the first brain because there is so much that is going on. And so many times when people are worried about mood and anxiety disorders, they're focusing on the brain when really a lot of, the root problem really stems from the gut. And the probiotic is super helpful for that. And now this new strain that, Kiran will get into more of the details of is so exciting because we're really focusing on the root cause, which is that stems from the gut.
Yeah. And so to add to what Tina said, and I'll do the super nerdy portion of it, right? That's maybe less eloquent, but let's talk a little bit about the gut-brain axis, because when we talk about the intimate connection between the gut and the brain, we understand that physically there's a number of ways they're connected. We have the vagus nerve, which Tina mentioned, which connects basically the brain, which is the central nervous system, to the gut, which is the enteric nervous system, right? And the enteric nervous system is actually more dense than our spinal cord itself in terms of nerve endings. So it's a very, very complex neurological system. It is really the other brain, if you will. The vagus nerve is one key thing, but the gut and the brain also talk through other channels. One is through the circulatory system, so through the blood channel, and then also through the lymphatic system, right? So we now know, and in fact, this was somewhat of a recent discovery, I think 5 years ago or so, that the brain has its own lymphatic drainage and lymphatic system. So all of that is connected and allows the gut and the brain to communicate with one another. Most of what you hear when you hear about the gut and the brain is how supportive the gut is to the brain and the brain is to the gut, and so on, right? How they're intimately connected and work together. There's one thing I want to start people to understand, and I do this in all my lectures, whether I'm lecturing to a group of doctors or health professionals of some sort, that not only is the gut supportive to the brain and the brain to the gut, but the part that we don't talk about enough is that if your gut is in unhealthy state, it is actually arguably the most toxic thing for your brain. So it goes from being this really important partner to the brain, supporting all kinds of neurological and brain functions, to being its biggest enemy, right? So that's the spectrum in which we're working in. And if you're experiencing stress and anxiety and mood disorders and sleep disorders, your gut is moving towards that super toxigenic side to the brain. And of course, all of that culminates, the toxic side of the brain culminates with long-term neurodegenerative conditions like Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, and dementia, and so on, right? So anxiety, mood disorders, and all that are pre-Alzheimer's, pre-Parkinson's, pre-dementia, and so on. So it's all the same pathophysiology. So when you look at how it's happening in the system, how is it that anxiety is being driven by inflammation, which is being driven by the gut? That is the same pathology as how Alzheimer's is created in the brain from a dysfunctional gut. So I just want to put that in perspective to people, because we want to make sure that if you judge yourself on where you are in the spectrum, whether you're on the very friendly side of the gut-brain axis or you're on the toxigenic side of the gut-brain axis, if you wake up every morning and you haven't slept well throughout the night, if you had a really hard time going to sleep the night before, if you feel stressed when you wake up in the morning, if you feel stress throughout the day, if you get anxiety feelings, if you get panic feelings, if you have mood disorders, that means you're moving towards that toxigenic part of the brain. So it becomes so important that we address this early on, because we all know that not only does that impact us as adults, it impacts our kids as well, right? Think about how many kids are going through anxiety and stress and sleep disorders and all that. So they, at a very early stage, are already moving to that toxigenic side of the spectrum. So that's just the first perspective, and then we can dig into all the fun stuff afterwards.
No, I love that you laid the foundation for this podcast, because the minute you bring in kids, I'm more inspired, even more inspired to protect my children and do right by them so that their gut isn't their biggest enemy and the biggest enemy to their brain. Because our experience here on earth is really how we feel and how we're flowing through our day. And if we're enjoying it and inspired by it, or if we do feel stressed and anxiety and mood disorder type tendencies, like, no one likes to feel that way, even if it's short term and not chronic. So
I want to help our audience learn how to protect their gut so that so it isn't becoming the biggest enemy to their brain. So when you, as a researcher, are looking at everything, all the research coming out and the microbiome research and how we can support it, what are the biggest tools for keeping our gut in a healthy place and protecting our brain?
Yeah, so that's a great question, because when I look at all the pathologies that impact the gut and the brain, all of the ways in which things can go wrong, all of the toxigenic pathways and the immunological pathways that create disruption in the brain that stem from the gut, there's really two big things that we need to pay attention to, right? There's two pathways that really allow the gut, a dysfunctional gut, to be toxic to the brain. The first one is leaky gut and the leaking through of something called endotoxins. I'm sure we probably talked about that in the last show, but the endotoxins are called LPS. That's the main one. Lots and lots of studies show, I can do a 5-hour PowerPoint on studies on LPS and toxicity to the brain, because lots and lots of studies show that when LPS leaks through and moves into circulation, it can make its way to all different parts of the brain. And in fact, your levels of LPS in circulation will be the main determining factor on whether or not you experience anxiety, depression, and it'll also determine the severity of your anxiety and depression. And there are big studies like these Netherlands mental health study. There was a study on over 2,000 patients for 9 years, right? And what they were looking at is, can we look at their blood LPS levels and their inflammatory cytokine levels that come as a result of the presence of LPS? And can we use that as a predictor to see, A, do they have anxiety and depression? And B, based on how high those levels are, does it dictate how severe the anxiety and depression is? And even on top of that, the presence of something called sickness behaviors within depressive disorders, right? Sickness behaviors are the things that really ruin your life. Things like anhedonia, which is the inability to feel happiness, right? So not only are you depressed, but there's nothing that excites you, nothing that gives you that elation feeling. Even people you love that come around you, you don't feel that, right? And then things like psychomotor slowness. So you just move slowly. Your coordination is off. Sleep disorders, of course, eating disorders that follow along with that as well. Even things like, sexual dysfunction or low libido in people. Those are called sickness behaviors. That's a separate subset of depression. What those studies showed is not only does LPS levels in your blood dictate whether you have anxiety or depression, it dictates how severe your anxiety and depression is, and if you will have sickness behaviors or not. And they followed these individuals over 9 years, and they found that to be true the whole time, including up to a 9-year follow-up, right? So leaky gut, LPS in your system is a significant issue. Here's the other thing with LPS causes. So LPS also is the number one driver of Alzheimer's. Right? In 2017, there was a study that showed that LPS was enriched in the perinuclear regions of the Alzheimer's brain, meaning this toxin is moving in from your gut, making its way into your brain, generating enough of an immunological response that kills brain cells, right? Now, your brain cells die throughout the day. The idea used to be that you only were born with a certain set of brain cells. And I think my mom tricked me with that to keep me from drinking much in college.
Right.
She always said that to me, right? And she's a doctor, so I believed her. She was always like, you only have a finite number of brain cells. Every time you have a drink, you kill some and you're going to get dumber as you go along. And I'm like, every time I have a drink, I'm like, oh my God, I'm getting dumber, but I'm having so much fun. But as it turns out, our brain cells could regenerate themselves, especially because there are compounds in the gut that are produced called BDNFs, brain-derived neurotrophic factor. Mm-hmm. So at night when you go to sleep, BDNF is supposed to go up. That helps regenerate the tissues in the brain that get damaged. If your gut is leaky and dysfunctional, that means you're not making BDNF. You're not repairing your brain at night. And all day, that LPS has been damaging brain tissues. So you're not getting the repair phase and you're increasing the damage. So over time, what that leads to is literally holes in your brain, neurodegeneration, that are shown as beta plaques and all that, right? The other thing, it also drives Parkinson's. Parkinson's is driven by gut-derived endotoxins. That's absolutely clear now, right? So we know that this LPS accumulation in your circulatory system is driving mood disorders early on, sleep disorders early on, dopamine issues, serotonin issues, and then over time, it's also causing the degeneration of your brain tissue. So big pathway number one to stop is stopping that LPS, right? How do we stop LPS? Well, it's all about sealing up the gut again. That was the whole foundation of the probiotic, the spore-based probiotic, the Just Thrive probiotic. It was designed from the get-go to stop LPS, right? We sat down and said, what is to us one of the most important features of a probiotic? And it became very apparently clear that if we could stop LPS, we can help a lot of people along the way. And so the Just Thrive takes care of that. Beyond that, what you want is things like a more diverse diet, right? So increased polyphenol intakes will increase the growth of microbes that protect the lining of the gut, increase resistant starches and oligosaccharide prebiotics, significantly increase the growth of microbes that protect the lining of the gut. Some fasting, if you're able to do some intermittent fasting from time to time, that helps as well. Getting out in nature, being in the outside environment, natural environment, not in the mall. The mall is not nature. Even if it's an outdoor mall, it's not quite the same. Right? Being out in the woods and doing a hike, those simple things, including not sterilizing your home completely, trying to improve the biome of your home, getting a dog into your home, all of those kinds of things that we talked about last time, those are all still really, really relevant, along with utilizing the spore-based probiotics for dealing with this LPS portion of the pathology, right? So beyond that, then there's a second one, but maybe I'll pause here in case Tina wants to add something to that, or any questions about that part.
Yes.
No, I think that was perfect. I mean, that's the first half of it. The first half of what causes this brain inflammation is the LPS toxins. It could go to any of your organs, but we know that it's going to the brain, and that is very problematic. So just the probiotic alone has been shown already to have that huge effect on LPS toxins seeping into the bloodstream, which is really exciting.
It is really exciting. And I have follow-up questions in regards to, these studies, this 2,000 patients. When you're looking at LPS and cytokine levels, what specific cytokines are you calling for in the blood? And can you just go to your doctor and get an LPS marker run? Or is there specialty labs or labs you really rely on? I like to give our audience the tools to be their own advocate if we have that availability.
Yeah, absolutely. So when you look at the most relevant cytokines, interleukin cytokines that are associated with anxiety, depression, and brain degeneration, that LPS increases, it's things like interleukin 6, right? So that's a quintessential inflammatory cytokine. Interleukin 1 beta, interleukin 8 is another one, interferon alpha, and TNF alpha as well. So if you even just look at those, that'll give you a real clear picture of all of the inflammatory damage that's going on in the system. LPS triggers all of those. In addition to that, there's a couple other surrogate markers for LPS that you can use. One is soluble CD14, so it's abbreviated SCD14, right? And then if people really want to understand what's happening in their blood, because one of the problems with long-term LPS exposure is it starts moving you towards more of an autoimmune type of response to everything, right? Because all of that inflammatory damage creates a potentiality for the start of autoimmune disease. Then as you look at all those inflammatory markers, you also want to look at something called IL-17, interleukin 17, and you want to look at SED rate. SED rate is a cheap and easy test most doctors can do and call for. SED rate gives you an idea whether or not your blood markers are moving towards an autoimmune type of system. Now, all of those cytokines that I described there can be ordered by most of the big labs, right? The LabCorp, US Labs, and so on. They have it on their immune panels. To measure LPS directly, it's hard to do outside of research because LPS has a very short half-life when you pull it out of the body. You have to freeze it to like minus 80 degrees, and which we do in the lab, but we can't do it reasonably. There's a couple labs. Vibrant has a immunological assay that looks for anti-LPS antibodies, right? So if those are elevated in your system, that means you likely experience high levels of LPS going up and down throughout the day. Cyrex Labs has an immunological assay towards LBP, which is LPS binding protein, which is a protein your immune system makes to look for and bind LPS and neutralize it, right? So I would say the Vibrant one is probably more accurate because it's a little bit more of a direct measure of LPS. Even though it's an immune response, marker. And if your immune system's not responding very well, it may not give you the full picture. But all of those inflammatory cytokines are very, very telling as well. And I think people really need to, we check basic things like blood pressure. We might check blood sugar levels and all that as our normal workups, but we don't really look at all of these inflammatory cytokines, which are the ones that really tell the tale, because those are the things that can be elevated for decades, causing damage, and we won't feel it. They're all subclinical in many ways until all of a sudden they've caused enough of a problem where, wow, now we have a way of diagnosing the new disease you have, right? That was actually in the works for the last 10 years.
I mean, when you listed off all of the interleukins, it's like interleukin 6 is the one that I'm most familiar with and most often called for with C-reactive protein and maybe homocysteine, but like to know that there are so many others. And TNF-alpha is also one that maybe is more commonly used with some of the physicians I work with, but just having these options, and even if you're going to your OB or your, whoever your intern is, like adding interleukin 6 to the list to just be like, am I inflamed? And then diving down that rabbit hole of like, maybe I need a Cyrex lab or maybe I need a Vibrant lab to go deeper in understanding what's really happening. If someone doesn't have the financial ability to go, because I know personally, Cyrex labs and Vibrant lab, they can start to add up. So if someone just has the ability maybe yearly to get that interleukin 6 and they see that it's slightly elevated, what can we do? Because obviously we don't want elevated levels of LPS. We don't want these elevated levels of cytokines. We don't want Alzheimer's. We don't want anxiety. We don't want depression. Like, what can we do on the day-to-day? I know you said fasting, you said added polyphenol rich foods, a variety of oligosaccharides, which is interesting because when anyone has a gut issue and someone puts them on a FODMAP diet, you're immediately decreasing the amount of
which drives me a little bit crazy, but yes.
So can we go there? If it drives you crazy, like, why is it driving you crazy, and what can people do to keep their diversity but also heal their gut and not have these responses? Because the whole reason why we put someone on a FODMAPs diet is because they're responding to everything that they're eating. They don't feel great. They have major bloating. They may have SIBO. They may have IBS, and someone just goes, here, well, just take all these things out that cause any kind of reaction in your gut and you'll be fine. But then they're stuck on that diet a lot of the times.
Yeah, that's true. And so the reason why it drives me crazy is because the philosophy is very similar to your standard allopathic approach, which is symptom management, right? The reason we eliminate all these things is because they provide unwanted symptoms. And so we go, all right, just stop eating those and you're fine, right? And people then have to live this new lifestyle of being in this restricted state without a whole lot of focus on how do we bring those things back, right? And also, how do we not go down a rabbit hole of continuously decreasing things? Because there's a certain degree of intolerance that we should experience as we try to rebuild the system so that our immune system and all that recognizes the foods again, right? To me, it's almost like the idea that I have allergies out there, and so I'm going to live in a sterile bubble, right? And avoidance of the environment is my solution to allergies. We don't do that, right? We work through the allergies. We use medications. We use diets. We use other things. And so I think the same thing with intolerances with food is that the most egregious things that gives you you're laid out in bed for 2 days or 3 days, fine, I understand it. But anything that gives you a little bloat, burp, skin thing, we should work through it at small doses. So what I tell people all the time is to try to start working with a practitioner that understands how the regulatory part of the immune system works, right? So we have something really fortunate in our system called oral tolerance. Our immune system is very naive. It doesn't know what to do, right? It's sitting there just waiting to kill stuff and react to things, right? Everything. It'll just react to anything. And that's its job. And so the big part of what regulates the immune system is actually the microbiome. It's the microbiome that sets up the rules of the immune system and says, don't react to this, react to this. And in fact, the microbiome sets a threshold at which the immune system decides to react even to things like viruses and pathogens and all, because over time, the systems become intelligent enough knowing that if the immune system is allowed to act to everything, it'll cause more damage than actual benefit, right? So even in a viral infection setting, the microbiome will actually wait until there's a certain level of viral load before it triggers a response of the immune system to respond to that virus, right? That's how intelligent it is. It sends signals. So there's signaling between the microbiome and the immune system. So what I tell people is, if you are highly sensitive to things, right? You're now down to like 4 foods. You can't eat anything else, and you've become really sensitive. Number one, there's a psychosomatic aspect to that as well, right? Because people will label themselves as very sensitive people. Mm-hmm. And whether you want to believe it or not, your brain is incredibly powerful. And if you go into any scenario, any new food, any new idea, thinking that you're going to be sensitive to it, the likelihood is that you will be sensitive to it, right? We know that that's a powerful illusion. It doesn't mean that it's not real, right? It is real. What you're experiencing is real, but we need to understand what the root drivers are. So that's the first thing, is we need to work on reframing us, where you don't label yourself as a highly sensitive person. I meet so many people that say, oh, I'm really sensitive to everything, The moment you tell yourself that, you're screwed, right? You're sensitive to everything. I can tell you from doing clinical research, we work so hard to work against the placebo effect because it's so powerful, right?
Right.
It can change your physiology if you believe it. And that's the whole part of it. 40% of effectiveness in most clinical trials comes from just the placebo effect alone. And so we have to recognize that, all right? So step one, let's try to reframe. That takes a lot of work, but people can do it.
Yeah.
Step number two, right? We need to start gaining exposure to microbes, right? And again, this goes back to being outdoors. So I'll give you a great example of that, right? So have you heard of the Finnish allergy study, right? That's a phenomenal long-term study in Finland, because they have this explosion epidemic of allergies and asthma in their kids, much like we do here as well. Mm-hmm. There's a town within Finland that is quite close to a town in Russia that's only a few hundred kilometers away. Very similar geography, very similar environments and all that, except the town in Russia has much lower incidence rates of allergies and asthma and all that. So the government of Finland funded a big, long study to figure out why is it that these people over here have such less rates of allergies, asthma, sensitivities than these people over here. And basically, they figured out that these people in Russia have much more exposure to microbes. They keep their windows open much more. The microbes are coming in from the outside. They don't sterilize their homes. Like in Northern Europe, the whole IKEA world, you're sterilizing everything, has to be spick and span clean, right? Mm-hmm. Not a good thing. So then they figured that out. Then what they did is they went one step further. They took a bunch of daycares in the country, and then they created these dirt pits in the daycare centers, right? And they're prescribed to the kids that X number of times a week you have to play in the dirt pit. And then they compared that to kids who were in normal daycares that didn't have the dirt pits. And sure enough, after a couple of years of follow-ups, the kids who had the dirt pits actually had less allergies, less asthma, less immune dysfunctions and all that, right? So it can be that simple. You can if you're sensitive to foods, go out on hikes regularly, right? Get in the dirt, get in the soil, be in contact with nature, get a dog into your household. That can help as well. So that's another thing you can do. Then what you want to do is utilize the right type of probiotic, like the spore-based probiotic, and start sealing up that leakiness in the gut and start up-regulating the Treg system in your immune cells, right? The Treg is a regulatory T cells that tells your immune system what to fight against and what not to fight against. What we've been able to do in our clinic in Chicago, which Tina has been to many a times. Tina, were you ever a patient in the clinic?
No, Billy was. My husband was our business partner. Yeah.
Okay. So in that clinic, what we used to do is try to get people back on foods that they were sensitive to. Now, again, it's different if you have like an anaphylactic reaction. Then it's a whole other thing. But if you're just sensitive to it, what we used to do is after a period of like, say, 3, 4, 5 weeks of taking the right probiotic, prebiotic, doing some of these other behaviors we talked about, getting out in nature, trying to modulate your microbiome, then we start introducing small amounts of those foods with the probiotic. Because in part, what that probiotic does is it drives the tolerance within the immune system, because the microbes go in with the food and go, all right, immune system, stop. You don't need to react to this. this is perfectly normal. And then you digest it and you move along. So you can do that sensitization over time with food. We all know that from all of you can go to allergists and get those shots, right? Every day for
microdoses.
Yeah, microdoses for months. It's a sensitization protocol, but you do it through the gut. You do it with the help of a probiotic to help recognize the food as not being harmful, and you can work your way up. This is all a slow process. I don't want to make it seem like it's easy. I don't want to make it seem like it's overnight, but it's so worth it. You have to do it, right? You cannot, if you talk to me and you come to me and say, oh, I feel fine as long as I don't eat this, and this, then you're screwed. So you need to really start working those foods back into the system.
So if someone's at home and they want to follow this type of a probiotic introduction protocol to desensitize their immune system, about how long on the Just Thrive probiotic and the prebiotic do they need to go before they start introducing foods with the probiotic? And would you have them, what would the protocol look like? Like how often are they introducing these foods? How long are they waiting? Are they just taking their probiotic with the foods at that time? Or are they taking it in the morning or at night too? Like what's the plan?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So I would say you want to stay in your avoidance type of diet, right? For at least 4 to 6 weeks. I would lean more towards 6 weeks. So you'd want to do the probiotic and prebiotic for that 6 week period. But in that 6 week period, you need to start the other lifestyle things that we talked about as well, right? So try not to sterilize most surfaces in your home. Your toilet's fine, your shower if you have to, but most surfaces don't need to be bleached and cleaned that way. Try to get outside more and then just start doing things like, mindfulness work and things that just help with inflammation and overall composition of your body. Then after that 6 week period, you want to pick a food category that you are sensitive to, but you're the least sensitive to, right? Okay. So let's say there's a whole bunch, there's a category of 5 categories of foods. The first one, you're like, oh, I eat it and I'm knocked out for 2 days. And then the other one is like, I eat it and I don't feel right. I get loose bowels and all that. So that's a good one to start with. You take small amounts of the food. So we're talking about, if it's an egg, for example, you wouldn't eat a whole egg. You would actually eat a bite of an egg, right? And you would eat a bite of an egg with that day's dose of the probiotic. You can take the capsule, but we've even gone as far as just sprinkling the probiotic on the food itself. So you're actually getting it in with the food itself, right? And then you do it once and you let your system respond to it and see how you feel for a couple of days. And then you do it again 2 days later, and you do it again 2 days later. And before you know it, within about a week and a half or so, you should be able to eat eggs every day without having an issue. Right? If it's dairy, for example, you want to get dairy back in your system because you love cheese and all that. Some of the easier dairies to do is things like yogurts because they're already fermented, they're already pre-digested, so they should be less egregious to your body. And you can, of course, mix the spores directly into the yogurt and just do a tablespoonful to begin with, right? So just be methodical about it. Give your body a day or so in between to rest and see how you feel, because some responses can be what we call delayed type hypersensitivity responses, which can take 24 to 48 hours to show up. And so you wanted to give your body that bit of time in between to see how you're actually responding to it. And if you are redeveloping tolerance to it, then you keep adding it into your diet. You don't remove it, right? So let's say you work through eggs for 2-3 weeks, and now you seem to be fine with eggs, and you want to move on to like dairy, you want to move on to yogurt, then you keep the eggs in your diet on a regular basis, and then you start slowly adding in the dairy, right? It's not like you stop the eggs and now you're on some dairy, right? So you keep building your diversity back that way. There are, you can take digestive enzymes. There's a number of things that you can do to try to help with breaking down those foods as well in the system. But for the most part, it's really about a tolerance issue and immunological tolerance, and the probiotics will help you overcome that.
I love it. You've so much great information as always. You mentioned Treg, and we've talked about antibodies here before, and you have your IgG product. Can you kind of break down the immune system so that people have a general 101 and explain how your products support it?
Yeah, absolutely. So looking through the immunological response, right? If we were an immune cell, basically, here's what happens. When something enters into your body, right? Let's say it's a virus or a bacteria, something that it should get an immunological reaction. one of the first things that signals to the immune system that, hey, something's here that you need to pay attention to are the microbes around that virus or bacteria, right? Mm-hmm. If that virus or bacteria are infecting the lungs or the gut or whatever other area, the microbes in that local area start shooting up flares, which are cytokines in particular. And that's part of the problem with having high levels of systemic IL-6 is when the microbes are trying to signal your immune system to come to a site of action, your immune system doesn't see the signal because there's IL-6 everywhere. Right. So it's kind of like if there are 500 homes in a neighborhood and one is on fire and the fire alarm's going off, but all other homes also have fire alarms, it would take forever for the fire engine to find that one home that's starting a fire, right? So that's one of the problems with IL-6 and how it suppresses the immune system. In fact, a large-scale study during COVID showed that IL-6 was one of the best predictors of how bad you're going to respond to COVID. You had elevated IL-6 because it takes your immune system that much longer to realize that you have the virus. That means the virus can multiply all this time for free, have a huge viral load, and then finally when the immune system does come in, it goes, holy crap, this is a much bigger problem than we thought, and it bombards everything and destroys all your tissues, right? So back to the immune system. So you've got the viruses come in the area, or whatever the bacteria is. The microbes in the local area shoot up flares. So the first responders to that site is called the innate immune system, right? They get there fast, they're quick, they're typically circulating anyway, so they're typically monitoring all the different regions in the body. As soon as they get there, they have no ability to understand specifically what the problem is, but they know that there's a problem in an area, right? So they just bombard that area with all kinds of tools that they have. They have things like the complement system, and they have like reactive oxygen species. They use all of these tools that just kills biological things in one given area. The analogy I give is like, if you get really irritated by mosquitoes coming in through your window, you grab a big blowtorch and you start blowtorching all the mosquitoes, right? You're going to kill the mosquitoes, but you're probably going to burn the house a little bit as well. Right. So that's the innate immune system, right? They get there, they're quite powerful. They're going to blowtorch that entire area. So they're going to destroy or at least contain to some degree what's causing the problem, but they're also damaging all the tissue in the area. That's why you don't want them doing all of the immune work. They should only be doing it for the first day and a half or two. Then the next phase that comes in is the adaptive immune system. The adaptive immune system contains tools that can specifically go after what the invading pathogen is, right? And the way the adaptive immune system gets triggered is that part of the innate immune cells are called macrophages and dendritic cells. They're called antigen-presenting cells because what they do is they come into this area where there's a battle going on and they grab debris from that area, hoping to grab the virus or the bacteria that is causing the problem, and then they present that to the adaptive immune system. So they go to the local lymph nodes and they present it to the adaptive immune system and they go, hey guys, this is what's causing the problem, right? Which of you T cells is the right cell for this? Which of you B cells is the right cell for this? And then the T cells and the B cells that are the correct cells for that particular type of antigen get activated, and then they go to the site of action, right? So the T cells come along and they are really good at neutralizing things. And then cytotoxic T cells will actually kill cells that are infected with that particular virus. B cells make antibodies. So then the right B cell gets activated and they go, I know what that is. I'm going to make a whole bunch of antibodies and send it over there to neutralize that target, right? So at that point, when the adaptive immune system takes over, that's when you should actually start to becoming asymptomatic, right? The fever, the lethargy, the aches and pains and all we feel when we're sick is the response of the innate immune system. That's the blowtorching that's happening, right? So you feel the blowtorching, you feel sick. And that can happen for 2, 3, 4 days, and then you slowly start recovering from that as the adaptive immune system comes along. Now, here's a really important part in all of that actually speaks to what we've been talking about. In that presentation of the potential targets, right, the dendritic cells and macrophages may accidentally grab your own tissue or your own proteins, because remember, the innate immune cells are blowing everything up, right? So there's cellular debris everywhere, including your own proteins. They will accidentally present your own protein to the T cells and B cells and go, this is the bad guy, right? They don't know whether or not that's the bad guy, but they will accidentally present it. And then if they do accidentally present it and they're successful at activating a B cell against this, then what happens is you start developing autoantibodies, right? The B cell is making antibodies to this protein, but it's your own protein. So that step is regulated by something called Treg cells, T regulatory cells. T regulatory cells kind of survey around this war zone, right? And the moment they see an antigen presenting cell grabbing the wrong thing to go present to the T cells and B cells, they stop it and they go, that's not the right thing, right? Don't present that, and so they regulate those kind of unwanted immune responses, right? So what's important here to note is the expression of the regulatory T cells are actually a byproduct of microbial induction of their expression, right? So you actually need a diverse set of microbes to upregulate the regulatory T cells. What happens is if you have a dysbiotic gut and you have low diversity, you don't get enough regulatory T cells out there. So you have all of these inflammatory responses going on in your body. You've got macrophages and dendritic cells continuously presenting antigens to your T cells and B cells, and often they will present the wrong thing. And if they present the wrong thing and there's no regulatory T cell there to dampen that response, then you'll start producing autoantibodies, right? That's how COVID goes into long hauler syndrome, because COVID is just a massive inflammatory condition, right? And in all of that inflammatory damage, you get accidental presentation of your own tissue, often neurological tissue in most people. And then now you've developed antibodies and an autoimmune response to your own tissue. And the people that are most susceptible to that are the people that have dysbiotic guts to begin with, because they don't have enough Treg functioning, right? Same thing that's happening in the gut lining. All kinds of inflammation when your gut is leaky, not enough microbes to stimulate Treg. So when food particles come in and your immune system goes, hey, I don't know if this is bad or good, it's a war zone, I'm attacking everything. So it starts attacking it. There's not a Treg cell to suppress that. And so you start developing intolerances and sensitivities.
All it is really telling us is that our gut microbial health is so critically important to our ability to produce these upregulate the T regulatory cells, keep our junctions tight, prevent the, food particles and LPS from getting through those junctures, creating what is massive chronic inflammation, food allergies, elevated interleukin 6 that makes everyone look like all the houses are on fire. Like you're getting me fired up just thinking about it. So, I think even for myself personally, when I have a client who presents, or a patient, client, I call it a client, I'm working with a doctor's patient. It's when I have a patient or a client who presents with markers of inflammation or leaky gut, a lot of times it's a protocol. And they're like, I'm going to get on these probiotics and these prebiotics or an IgG or some colostrum, or I'm going to do this diet or this cleanse, quote unquote, as a protocol. And they get really keyed up about it. They're like bummed for their diagnosis, but they're ready to get going. And they do the program for 6 weeks, 8 weeks, maybe they're on it for 3 or 6 months, like the long-term ones. But then eventually life starts happening. They stop taking their probiotics. Maybe they get an infection. They go on some antibiotics. Something happens stressful. Yeah. And then it's like, they feel like they're starting over and over and over again. And I would love for you to address, because there is this theory going around, it's not backed by literature to me, that people need to be switching probiotics, or that they just should take it for a little bit of time, or they don't need to supplement. And my experience has been that most people have some deficiencies going on and we need a base level of nutrition. Most people are coming in contact with endocrine disrupting chemicals and things that break down the gut on a regular basis. Unless you are living in an egg somewhere, but an egg full of microbes, you're probably something's going on. So can you talk to me about how long someone should be on a probiotic, how long they should be on a prebiotic, what general maintenance looks like when it comes to supplements? And then we have to go into psychobiotics and the BL 1714 and all the things that you've come out with next.
Yeah, for sure. So, I'm a clinical microbiologist, but I'm a closeted evolutionary biologist as well, right? So I don't say that out loud because those guys are real nerds and I don't want to brand myself. But, every time I look at things like protocols and how you use probiotics and prebiotics and all that, to me, my inclination is always like, what happened in nature, right? How is it supposed to happen in nature? And can we mimic that? Because anytime we try to outsmart nature, which is the whole advent of modern medicine, is outsmarting nature, interfering with particular pathways and all that with small molecules, we tend to see side effects of things that really are sometimes even worse than the key issue that we're trying to deal with, right? So when I think about probiotics and I go, okay, where did our ancestors get their probiotics and how often did they get it? They certainly didn't get it out of refrigerators, right? They certainly didn't get it methodically in between meals, right? They basically had a mutualistic relationship with bacteria in the environment, right? And most of what they consumed, they got through their diet. They got through eating it in food and drinking it out of rivers and streams and all that. So there's a constant osmosis between microbes in the environment and microbes in our system. And one of the things that's really important to point out is that humans, as a system, we're wholly inadequate to function, right? We only have 22,000 functional genes in our chromosome. If you compare that to an earthworm that has 30,000 functional genes, right? We really are primitive when we think about it, right? We're not as cool as an earthworm, but then why is it that we're so high up on the evolutionary ladder and high up in this food chain? It's because we have 2.5 million microbial genes in our system, right? So the microbial genes conduct most of the function. So when you understand that, what you have to picture is as we were evolving on this planet, we basically developed this mutualistic relationship where certain critical housekeeping functions we outsource to bacteria because we don't have enough genetic capability to do it ourselves, right? And so because we've outsourced these key functionalities to bacteria, and I'll give you a couple examples of it, we then need to continue to get exposure to these bacteria, right? Evolutionary biology and Mother Nature had no idea that we would create a lifestyle where we have divorced ourselves from the microbial world, right? Where we don't gain exposure like we're supposed to. So it was fine for the development of us as a species to outsource critical function to microbes because we should always be around these microbes, right? So when you think about it from that context, a real true probiotic that's really effective in your system is one that is an effector strain, meaning one that can go in and create effects in your system that impact the rest of your microbiome, that impact your immune cells, that clean up damage that has occurred in your system from all the inevitable exposures that are bad. And then at some point they leave, right? Because they go back in the environment and then you can get re-exposed to them again. So a true probiotic you should be exposed to on a regular basis, right? You should be taking it on a regular basis. We have this misconception that somehow we're supposed to get a big diversity of bacteria through probiotics. The problem with that is you cannot increase diversity in your microbiome if you're hoping to seed your microbiome with probiotic bacteria because you cannot take enough to impact diversity in that manner, right? So if you look at most really multi-strain probiotics, they're made up of Lactobacillus and bifidobacteria species, right? Those are 2 genuses. So even if you take one that has 50 of those species in it, right, you're only affecting 2 genuses in your entire microbiome. And lactobacilli make up 1% of the bacteria in a healthy microbiome, bifidobacteria another 2.5% or so. So yes, maybe you could be impacting those 3%, but what about the other 97%? And most of those are anaerobic. Most of those have never seen the light of day. They don't live outside of the body because they're so specialized to be inside of the body. So the focus on increasing the diversity in the microbiome, providing a much more robust ecosystem, is to work with species and nutrients and all that increase the rest of those 97% of genuses, right? So to me, probiotic is something that we know will impact the rest of the microbiome in a positive way. We've published studies on the spores showing a 30% increase in diversity in the microbiome in as little as 3 weeks of taking it, right? Where you start to see huge expressions of really low-level species that weren't expressed before starting it. So you start to get more uniformity, better functionality out of the microbiome. You add in an oligosaccharide prebiotic that goes up even a little bit more. And that is the effector type of strain you need. And because, like you pointed out, we have so many things we're exposed to that hurts the microbiome on a regular basis, we need something daily that helps and supports the microbiome, right? So to me, you find a good probiotic, one that has research that impacts the microbiome in a positive way, and you keep taking it. Right. Our ancestors did that every single day.
Right. And they were getting it on foods that weren't sprayed with pesticides, that had natural microbes and dirt all over them, and they weren't sanitizing everything. So I completely agree with you. And you guys know the positive impact that Just Thrive had on my family through Sebastian after his birth. And, to see that type of healing personally, it's, that's why I connected with you guys. That's why you're here. That's why I want to know about the things that you're creating, because if you can take another mama out of the pain of watching their child deal with things like eczema and, bloody stools and horrible things like that, that my experience was like, he was obviously healing his microbiome through my breast milk and Just Thrive and the prebiotics in his bottle. So really thankful to you guys for that. So let's talk about Psychobiotics, because there are so many people coming out of the pandemic with, an overwhelm, feeling anxious, feeling depressed. And we know, as you mentioned earlier, that these are really the first flares, the first red flags to what may eventually be neurodegenerative disease and major brain inflammation. So what is Just Calm? What are these psychobiotics that you've chosen? What is BL 1714? Yeah. Can you explain it? You can, because you're the smartest guy ever. So just explain it.
Tina, do you want to give you, and then I'll jump in with the nerdy stuff. I feel
like
much.
Sure. Yeah. Well, Kiran had kind of talked about the first offender of brain health and brain inflammation, and that's the LPS toxins. And he went into a great explanation on that. So there's another driver of brain inflammation, and those are those external stressors that we deal with on a daily basis, from traffic to fighting with a loved one to fear and social isolation and everything that we've been dealing with for the last couple of years. And so these external stressors start to, activate the HPA axis. And so now that starts to produce cortisol. And now we have cortisol, which is causing more inflammation. And so the bifidolongum 1714 strain that Kiran will go into great detail on is addressing these external stressors. We're not going to get away from them. We can't live our lives anymore without them. We know they're around us. And now we have something that will help arrest those external stressors and allow us to deal with it better. And the research on it is so compelling. And I think what you touched on, Kelly, is just the fact that our kids are so affected by, stress and everything that's going on in this world. I mean, they are at an epidemic level of just dealing with the stress in their lives. And so we're really excited, because even with the spores, it was so fun for me. I'm a mother of 3 kids, and just being able to know that we're making such an impact on kids' lives with allergies and different types of conditions is so exciting. And then now we have something that actually help mood and help them deal with mood is really exciting. And the studies on the bifidolongum strain are so compelling. And I'll let Kiran get into that part of it. He's much more eloquent than I am when he's talking about studies.
Yeah. So Tina was actually part of the inspiration of developing this, because when I first met Tina a decade ago, she was very high strung and stressed all the time. And I was like, we need a Tina biotic to help with this situation.
Oh, you are right.
But how old were her kids though?
Yeah.
How old were her kids?
I'm starting a business. I'm bootstrapping a business. I had reason to be stressed out. So
yes, you did. You very much did. And your kids were at high school for the most part, right? So that's a stressful time. But so let's talk about stress for a moment, right? Stress is an amazing thing, because stress has kept us alive as a species since the beginning of time. If we didn't have stress, if we didn't have the byproducts of stress, we would have died off as a species. I'll give you an example. There's lots of studies showing on mice, like no biotic mice that you raised without any microbiome, and if you cut like the vagus nerve, for example, or there's other ways of attenuating the stress response in the mice, you put them in a cage with a snake, And the mouse just like wanders up and goes and licks the snake in the face and like has zero fear, right? And then the snake just eats the mouse and it's done. And then you're like, okay, I guess we need the stress response so that we don't get eaten by things. But what allowed us to survive, what we call the flight or fight response, which is really what happens when you experience stress, is a perfectly normal physiological response. The big difference today compared to when it was helping us survive in the past is that we can't come down from it, right? That's the big fundamental difference. And the reason we can't come down from it, because as it turns out, the gut is the critical checkpoint for getting you to come down from the flight or fight cycle, right? So let me explain how that happens. So you're walking down the street and something stresses you out, whether it's something really minuscule or something actually scary. The first thing that precedes that stress is your hypothalamus, right? So your hypothalamus, when it gets the auditory and visual cues, the hypothalamus kicks on, and then the hypothalamus releases a hormone that triggers your pituitary gland. Your pituitary gland then releases another hormone called ACTH, which then activates your adrenals, and the adrenals release cortisol, right? And cortisol is the known quintessential stress hormone, right? Mm-hmm. So we'll talk about cortisol in a second. Then on the other side of the brain stem, what's happening is the hypothalamus is also triggering your sympathetic nervous system, right? The sympathetic nervous system now helps get your body to fight or flee. What the sympathetic nervous system is trying to do is, number one, increase your respiratory rate, increase your heart rate, right? And then also start concentrating blood towards places like your brain and your heart and your muscles so that you can physically function and you can fight or flee from whatever you're trying to deal with. Now, the way the sympathetic nervous system increases blood flow to places like your brain and your heart is it uses the immune system, right? So the way it uses the immune system, it releases a series of chemicals called catecholamines in the central nervous system, because remember, your sympathetic nervous system is part of your central nervous system, right? It's in your spinal cord, in your brain and all that. So it releases these catecholamines all over your brain and your central nervous system, which actually attracts macrophage cells. Remember those cells we talked about in the immune system that present antigens to T cells and B cells. The macrophages come along and they see these catecholamines and they create an inflammatory response in response to the catecholamines. So it releases all of these inflammatory cytokines, thereby recruiting other immune cells to the area that release more inflammatory cytokines. Now, the reason it's doing that is inflammation is perfusion, right? That inflammation drives blood to the area. Mm-hmm. Just like you cut yourself on your hand, it all becomes red because that area got inflammation to try to bring growth factors and all that to heal that cut, right? So now what you're experiencing is inflammation in your brain and inflammation in your central nervous system, in your heart, and in your muscles, because your body's trying to drive blood to that area. Blood is diverted away from your digestive tract. It's diverted away from other parts of your immune system. You're now getting this flushing of your critical mass areas where your body wants blood, right? So that's what your sympathetic nervous system is doing. It's making you alert. It's increase your respiration. It's increase your vasodilation, and it's shoveling blood to places like your brain. Now let's talk about cortisol, right? So then cortisol, as we talked about, gets released, and cortisol levels keep going up and up and up and up as you're feeling stress. Part of cortisol cycling is it gets dumped into the gut. And you might go, why the hell is cortisol dumped into the gut? Well, there's a few reasons. Number one, because in the gut, there are microbes that actually metabolize cortisol and create these byproducts that are sent to the kidneys. And in the kidneys, they open up sodium and potassium channels and flood the blood system with sodium to increase blood pressure, right? Because as much as we need perfusion, we need the pressure in the blood, in the circulatory system to drive blood. So here you are inflamed, your blood pressure is way up, right? And you're ready to fight or flee. And that's important in that moment, right? Because that may be the difference between life or death for you, right? So that's perfectly fine. But your body knows you can't stay in that state the whole time. So now there's some feedback mechanisms starting to work. One of those feedback mechanisms is cortisol in the gut. As cortisol accumulates in the gut and other parts adjacent to the gut, they start binding up things called glucocorticoid receptors. When cortisol binds glucocorticoid receptors, and as more and more of those receptors are bound, the receptors send a negative feedback signal to turn down the HPA axis and the sympathetic nervous system. So that becomes kind of the negative feedback, right? So cortisol gives you the response, you're flighting, fleeing, or whatever you're doing, and then eventually cortisol levels start to dip and start binding up glucocorticoid receptors, and that tells the whole system to calm down, right? So now your sympathetic nervous system calms down, your parasympathetic starts to go back up, and you start recovering from all that inflammatory damage. You can go back to digesting, you can go back to resting and recovery, right? Here's where everything gets messed up in the modern world, right? Cortisol levels go up, sympathetic nervous system activates like normal, even though it's not like a predator that is attacking us or thinking about attacking us, and it's just a coworker saying a comment or someone cuts you off on the highway. Even though those are seemingly minuscule things, they elicit the same biochemical response,
right,
as being almost killed, right? So cortisol is going up, it's dumping into the gut. If our gut is unhealthy and missing a few critical components, what cortisol does in the gut is it actually makes the gut leaky and profoundly leaky in that moment, right? And one of the first things that goes up when your gut is leaky is what we talked about earlier, IL-6, right? IL-6 is particularly egregious in this whole pattern of stress response because what IL-6 does is as its level accumulates, it actually makes its way through circulation and reactivates your HPA axis. IL-6 can trigger the hypothalamus again. So then now the hypothalamus goes into this whole HPA activation cycle, causing more release of cortisol, which causes more leakiness of the gut, which causes more IL-6 and more HPA activation. It's what we call it is this continuous HPA activation. It's an inflammatory mediated HPA activation that occurs from a single stressor, right? So that one stressor in the morning can continuously activate your HPA axis throughout the day and keep you in the flight or fight response the entire day. Now, if that wasn't enough, interleukin-6 does another very egregious thing. It actually reduces the expression of those glucocorticoid receptors. The ones that
ones that turn it off go away.
Exactly, right? You can't turn off the system because the glucocorticoid receptors are the ones that bind cortisol and then send the negative feedback to go, okay, everything's cool, let's turn it down. Those receptor expressions go away. Now you can't turn it off. So the HPA axis is continuously on, and you can't turn it off because you're losing the negative feedback. Your sympathetic nervous system is always on. You're always rushing inflammation and blood to the brain and other areas. So now, because somebody cut you off in the morning or the kids didn't get ready fast enough to get to school, you're running late for something, whatever the thing is, the rest of the day you're paying for it and your brain is getting damaged. And what we see is that when you're in that state, your brainwave function changes, right? The coping centers of your brain start to deactivate and stop functioning. You go into a brainwave state that keeps you at this high alert, this fight or flight state, and you cannot deal with additional stressors that come on because your coping centers aren't working. So what happens is one stressor in the morning makes you elevated, right? And now you're still in this HPA cycling. Then the second stressor mid-morning jumps everything up a notch. The third stressor late morning jumps everything up a notch. And before you know it, you are having a bad day because of 3 or 4 stressors that come along because your tolerance for each thing reduces over time, right? So we're not in a state of going up and coming down and being able to deal and rationalize with things. That coping center of the brain is so important because more and more what we're finding out is that activation of the coping centers of the brain is really critical to rationalize the degree of danger that the stressors present, right? If it's just a rude comment online, it's not really a danger, but for a lot of people, that can be a big workup, right? But if the coping centers of the brain are active, it goes, that's not a big issue. Just ignore it or delete that person, whatever the solution may be, and move on, right? If that part of the brain is not working, then that one stressor keeps the system activated. Then the next comment that comes in seems even more of a profound impact on you. So all of this is happening because you don't have the right component in the gut to deal with cortisol dumping in and making the gut leaky, right? And it's really just one key component that you need in the gut to stifle all of this.
No one wants to be on this continuous HPA axis, inflammation mediated depression cycle of stress and irritability. Like, we all need help off the treadmill.
We do. Yeah. And of course, keep in mind, you can't sleep at night because of this, right? Because you can't sleep in the sympathetic state. You can't sleep when your HPA axis is activated. Biologically, of course, your body doesn't want you to sleep when you're experiencing danger. And so that's the big reason why once we get to the evening, we can't come down from it. Yes, bad behaviors like looking at blue light and all that will impact melatonin production and all that. But know this, that when you're in that state, in that inflammatory state, especially driven by cortisol-mediated intestinal permeability and IL-6 elevation, tryptophan, which is a precursor to melatonin and serotonin, right? Tryptophan gets triggered to turn into kynurenine and quinolinic acid instead of melatonin and serotonin, which means that tryptophan, which should become neuroprotective, which is melatonin and serotonin, actually becomes neurotoxic to you, right? So it shifts a lot of the metabolic processes to facilitate this toxicity and this inflammation. So if you're trying to go to bed, you can't make melatonin because even if you have adequate tryptophan, it's all being turned into this neurotoxic chemistry that's making it. And then at the end of the day, when you feel this continuous basal level of anxiety over time, it breeds in this sense of hopelessness. And of course, it's also reducing serotonin over time. Then that's when the depression sets in, right? So then you go from being anxious about things to having this basal anxiety level throughout the day to having spikes of maybe almost panic because your tolerance for things is reducing. And then eventually sense of hopelessness, serotonin levels go way down, and then you build in depression as well, right? And we try to modulate that by stimulating dopamine, by eating certain things, by drinking wine all day, doing all that kind of stuff is a way of trying to mask some of it. But at the end of the day, if your gut is healthy, you won't experience most of those things. So we can talk about what the gut needs in order to do that.
Yeah, let's jump right into what the gut needs and how you guys are helping.
Yeah.
Thank you for the science, by the way, because I think that this is my favorite part, is really just understanding and taking a step back and saying, hey, if someone is feeling hopeless, like, I think society or someone might say, like, just add something to your to-do list, like add meditation and sometimes they're in a state of, not to say disrepair, but like you're in a state where you're like, I need actual help here, and adding something to my to-do list isn't doing it. But knowing that there's pathology here and that there's that you can break down the just the physiology of all of it and like the chemicals and what we're creating, to know that there's hope or that there is something proactive that isn't a big to do is really helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love explaining this because to me, it empowers people to know that they're not necessarily at fault, for feeling the way they feel. A lot of people around me are stressed all the time and small things really bother them and it's hard for them to get over it and all that. And people that don't experience that, the response tends to be, oh, just get over it or just don't think about it, and they minimize the problem, right? Or people try really hard. They read every kind of self-help book. They're doing their meditations. They're doing all these things. All of these things are good. But if physiologically your system is not being geared towards resting and recovering, it becomes really hard to, meditate your way out of that, right? So it's important to know. So I'm glad you bring that up. What we discovered is, we work with this research group, the biggest microbiome research group in the world. It's called the APC, based in Cork, Ireland. They are just world-class, right? Microbiome research. Have pumped out thousands of papers on the microbiome. And we have all the privilege of working with this amazing group of researchers and scientists. And so over the last about 8 years, there's been a development to understand the role of the gut in modulating stress response. And basically it started with just kind of screening individuals, like people that slept really well, had really good stress response, compare them to age match people who had really poor stress response, don't sleep well, looking at the microbiomes, trying to figure out what is the difference, right? One of the things that became apparent is that certain types of organisms were quite a bit different in the individuals that had stress versus those that didn't. The ones that didn't had this Bifidobacterium longum species that had this exopolysaccharide around it. And the exopolysaccharide is made up of something called peptidoglycans, right? And peptidoglycans are a bacterial byproduct that are made by certain bacteria in the gut, in your gut, and these are your commensal bacteria that become critically important for brain health from day one. In fact, day zero. So in utero, when you had all your wonderful babies, Kelly, they in utero, your peptidoglycan bacteria from your gut was being made and secreted into your circulation. It actually got carried to the placenta. On the baby's placenta, there are transporters for bacterial peptidoglycan, right? That then take it through the blood into the baby's brain, and the baby's brain has peptidoglycan receptors. And binding the peptidoglycan receptors stimulates brain development. It stimulates differentiation of the different parts of the brain. It stimulates the synaptogenesis, so how many synaptic regions your baby's brain has, which dictates intelligence and quotient and all that stuff. And then it dictates myelination of the central nervous system, right? And then also the development of the blood-brain barrier. All of that critical stuff, we can argue as being maybe one of the most important things we want to happen for our babies, right? We want their brains to develop adequately. We have outsourced to bacteria to stimulate that. This goes back to my early thing about probiotics, right? How we are wholly inadequate to do everything we need to get done. So over time, we've outsourced certain critical functions to bacteria. The development of our human babies' brains are dependent on a byproduct of bacteria, which is just mind-boggling, right? So even for me, and I really appreciate bacteria probably
more than most people.
Totally. And it's nice. When I'm reading this research, I'm going, holy cow, that's such an interesting evolutionary development that we've gone, all right, microbes, you make the stuff that develops our baby's brain, and we're just going to give you a place to make it, right? And it's just mind-boggling when you think that. Now, so that same peptidoglycan that was so critical for modulation and development of the baby's brain in utero, that same peptidoglycan is what stops cortisol from making your gut leaky when it gets dumped into the gut. And it completely shuts that inflammatory passage that shuts, triggers tryptophan from going to be melatonin and serotonin, instead becoming kynurenine and quinolinic acid, right? So it stops all of that recycling so that you can experience a stressor. Cortisol levels go up as it should, dumps into the gut as it should, gets metabolized to a certain degree, increases blood pressure, but at the same time does not cause leaky gut, does not cause elevation of IL-6, does not cause reactivation of the HPA axis, but instead can bind the glucocorticoid receptors and give you the negative feedback so you can actually come down from the stress, right? If that wasn't enough, we found that these peptidoglycan-rich, species, and I call these, Bifidolongum to me has always been a keystone organism, right? Because it's so important for overall health to have adequate levels of Bifidobacterium. And this is a unique version of Bifidobacterium that has this peptidoglycan layer on the outside. Most Bifidobacterium longum don't have peptidoglycan, so this is a very unique version of it. Not only is it doing all of that, stopping the impact of cortisol and the reactivation of the HPA axis, we're also finding out that it has the ability to change your brainwave function, right? It can bind to receptors on the gut lining, which actually send neurotransmitter signals to the brain in response to stress to shift your brainwaves to deal with the stress better, right? We've published on this. The APC is published on this, right? Not us, not the company itself. We've worked with the APC to do this. So these are the top researchers in the world in this area. They have published studies showing that when you take an individual, and these are placebo double-blind controlled studies, when you take individuals, you dose them up on the 17-14 and compare them to a placebo group, and you induce a stressor in those groups. And I'll talk about how we've induced stress in a couple different groups. But you induce a stressor and you look at their cortisol response, inflammatory response, brainwave response. The placebo group gets this cortisol, continuous HPA activation, inflammation goes way up, right? And their brainwaves are toggling between the sympathetic and like overactive portion of it. The supplemental group gets a cortisol response, but it actually peaks much lower and it comes back down. Then you start to see no inflammatory mediators going up. And then you start to see the brain waves going into theta waves, right? theta waves are the meditative state that actually makes you calm. So your brain is not only going, oh my God, don't freak out, but your brain is going, let's just chill out. Let's go into this calm, relaxed state where we can be like introspective and esoteric and just not be bothered about this stuff, right? Totally, we're turning on theta waves and we're turning on delta waves as well, which actually helps you with some of that cognition. And we saw the coping centers of the brain firing up. And the coping centers of the brain are so important, as we talked about earlier, because it helps you rationalize through the stressor. And it negates the negative emotions involved with stress response, right? Completely changing everything. Then we go, okay, if it's doing this all throughout the day, it's got to help you sleep at night, right? So sure enough, as we started doing, we've done 2 sleep studies now. We've got 2 more going on right now. At the moment, we've published 2 sleep studies. Sorry, we have 2 more ongoing. And what we see is that a significant reduction in time to sleep, so how long it takes you to fall asleep, and a significant improvement in quality of sleep through the night, right? You're going better into deep REM sleep. You're getting more vivid dreams. It's one of the side effects that people respond with. Like, I had some vivid dreams, and I can tell you about one I had recently on a plane, of all things. But that's what all of this one bacteria is doing all of this, right? And we've outsourced this type of corrective response to microbes like this. We can't do this ourselves. It's all based on the bacteria.
Oh, I have so many questions. So
Yes.
Bifidolongum and the type that has these peptoglycans on it that is so beneficial. Is there a way, like if you were getting a stool test and looking at bacteria that was present in the colon, would you be able to see if this specific like Bifidolongum was like under, like there was a low production of it, or you had low amounts of it? Or, because people always say, oh, my husband always says, it's your personality, it's baked in, like you're go with the flow, and I'm ready with, a fire hose and a blowtorch, and he's ready to protect the house, right? But the more that the microbiome research comes out, the more I think like it's not our baked in personalities as much as there has to be these chemical byproducts that protect us. And what you're telling me is that there are. So I'm curious, why couldn't we just be taking Just Calm for some people, taking it throughout the day and at night? Or, what can we do? How can we use it? How can we find out if we have these types, this strain or, genus in our body?
Yeah, it depends on the stool test. So what you need is a whole genome sequencing test. 16S, which is what most of those stool tests have out there, aren't going to be specific enough to tell you that it's a longum strain effectively, right? But if you do a whole genome sequencing test, like we do a test called Biome Effects through doctors, that's a whole genome sequencing test. It'll tell you how much longum you have in your microbiome compared to other microbes. Now, we can go as far as distinguishing longum to 1714 longum, but I think that'll have to be a special call up. But the technology is there to do it. But I can tell you, we've done 7,000 or so microbiome tests so far in ill patients, and we see very little Bifidolongum in most people, like almost undetectable levels in most people. So it is one of those species that we're losing as a result of our behavior choices, lifestyle choices, environment. Yep. It's one of those keystone species that we're losing over time, which means that we are going to be less and less adapted to dealing with stressors over time, right? So it becomes important to put it back into the system right now. And what's interesting about the longum species is bifidobacteria in general tend to be very sensitive. So it's hard for it to survive through the gastric system and through the upper GI. But the peptidoglycan layer around this bifidobacteria actually allows it to survive better. So it has that unique property in being able to do that. And in my view, that is probably, there's one reason, one byproduct of that is it allows us to share that microbe amongst each other, right? A lot of the bifidobacteria that lives in your gut, you got directly from mom, mostly through breastfeeding, right? That's where you get your first initial inoculum of bifidobacteria. In the first 6 months of life, bifidobacteria take over in your gut, in the infant gut microbiome. And then they help make the space anaerobic. And then after 6 months, you start seeing more diversity coming in. So it's hard to get bifidobacteria naturally anywhere else, right? After that, unless you're nursing as an adult. Most adults, as far as I know, don't nurse. And so in order to get this bifidobacteria, because this is one that can actually survive being outside of the body for a period of time and then go back in the digestive tract, this is one that can be shared within communities as you spend close amounts of times or intimate settings, right? Kissing and things like that, that can actually convey this microbe between people. So I think that's another cool little side effect of this microbe, is that it's one that communities can share and improve the overall mental health of the entire community, and that's an important aspect of it. So the product, I think you take, Tina, if I'm not mistaken, is it once a day? It's just one capsule or 2 capsules?
And the exciting thing is we actually launched it under a new sub-brand. So it's called Joot, J-O-O-T. So we took the J from Just and the T from Thrive and added 2 O's in the middle. And we just were so excited about the science behind it and bringing out a whole new flagship product under Just Thrive's brand, because it is so unique. And we really want it out there to so many people because we've seen it already, how it's helped so many people. So we're really excited about that.
Well, you guys are always on a strike mission to attack one little area at a time, which you think is the most important. And it's very timely. And I love these type of alternatives for people, especially if they're dealing with malaise and they're overwhelmed, and to have these type of options is amazing. So thank you for putting the work in your lab and Tina and your company to create this and make it available to people. I'm going to throw a discount code in intro to this and an exit as well. But why don't you guys tell everyone where they can follow along and learn more about Just Thrive and the research you're doing?
Yeah, the best place to go is our website, which is justthrivehealth.com. And we have a coupon code for your listeners. It's just Be Well by Kelly for 15% off. So
there you go.
Yeah.
Easy to remember.
Easy to remember. Yes.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah. And overall, we talk about a lot today, but now when you break it down and you go, spore-based probiotic dealing with the LPS, the bifidolongum 1714 dealing with the impact of cortisol and the reactivation of HPA axis. When you can deal with both of those together at the same time, then you're really covering the vast majority of pathologies that make the gut toxic to the brain, right? Because this reactivation of the HPA axis through cortisol impact in the gut is one of those really egregious toxigenic impacts to the brain. So between those two, it became our mission to go, how do we solve those biggest problems? And what solutions can we put forward? So between the two, we call it total brain support, rest and digest, or digest and rest. You've got all of these important pathologies that are covered now between those two products. And then all the other things you do for mindfulness work and all that will just be improved significantly. Not that you should stop doing any of those things, but this gives you the biochemical or the microbiological support that you need for your system to function the way it should.
Well, thank you for playing whack-a-mole on our biggest offenders like LPS, interleukin-6, and cortisol.
Yes, we're here to solve big problems. We're a bit of science megalomaniacs because we're like, what is the biggest problem? Let's solve it, right? And so, that's what gets us out of bed at night in the morning and makes us excited. So it's a pleasure to be able to talk to you about this.
Well, thank you for spending so much time.
My pleasure.
Thank you for listening to Be Well by Kelly. Please subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Learn more at bewellbykelly.com and follow me on Instagram at bewellbykelly. I would love if you picked up my books, Body Love and Body Love Every Day. They're sold on Amazon and at all major booksellers.